This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I've got a bit of a different device than what I usually cover here on this channel, but I still think that what we're doing today should be pretty interesting. This right here is an old Soundcraft gig rack powered mixer that a friend of mine says one of the amplifier channels is no longer working on. Though it's an older piece of equipment, it's still definitely useful, so let's see if I'm able to recreate the issue and possibly fix it. Plus, while I'm at it, I'm going to give this mixer a little bit of a restoration because, as we'll soon see, it's definitely a little bit worn down. Interestingly, this mixer has the signal routing options to drive either 2 main PA speakers or 1 main PA speaker and a stage monitor speaker. According to my friend, amplifier channel 2 shouldn't function in either of these modes. Though my friend has been doing sound for a long time, and I trust that he knows how to troubleshoot his own gear thoroughly, I operate on a trust but verify system, so let's double check to see if this amplifier works or not. The amplifier outputs have 2 different connector types available to them. According to the user manual for this unit, each output type should be wired identically to the amplifier inside, so the different jacks are only used for versatility when connecting to different systems. Since I don't personally own any PA equipment, I can't use the Neutrik speak-on connectors to connect to some proper PA speakers, but I do have some of these 1/4" TS to Euroblock connectors, which I just screwed some alligator wires onto so that I can test the amplifiers with some speaker drivers I have laying around. But anyway, I plugged in power, 2 speaker drivers with 1 on each amp channel, a handheld microphone to channel 1, and then powered on the mixer. I started my testing process, which involved going through all 8 of the microphone inputs and making sure that the microphone signal came out of both speakers when the amplifiers were configured in the 2 main PA speaker mode, as well as when they were configured to run in a single main and single monitor mode. Going through all the channels indicated that there was no issue with either of the amplifiers, which I found surprising, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Then I grabbed an insert cable that I could use to throw some music from my phone through some of the mixer's RCA inputs, just to ensure that those were also working as expected. Sure enough, everything was going just fine. When putting signal through the playback in RCA inputs though, the music only came through the left and right main channels and not the monitor channel when the channels are set to split between monitor and main. However, after checking the user manual, this seems to be intended behavior by Soundcraft, and so I don't think that this is the issue I'm looking for. So it turns out that maybe this mixer isn't broken after all, which hopefully isn't too much of a surprise, as I don't plan to lure you into this video with the idea of maybe fixing a broken mixer just for the mixer to not be broken. In any case, I still want to give this mixer a bit of a restoration, as it's almost certainly in need of cleaning, as well as some new fans, because the current ones sound like, well, old fans. So let's crack this mixer open to replace the fans and give it the cleaning that it deserves, while also hopefully checking out the circuitry that makes this thing tick, as I always think that looking at the internals of different devices is fun. After pulling the main chassis out of the plastic housing, it became even more apparent that this mixer had definitely seen better days. However, it did spend a significant portion of its life in Florida, so the corrosion isn't really that shocking. The only thing I'm concerned about is whether or not this corrosion has affected the boards inside the mixer as well, and I'm really hoping that it hasn't. If it has, depending on the severity of it, it could mean that this mixer, even though it works right now, might be toast sooner rather than later. One thing that I find really nice about this device though, is how easy it is to take apart and service. Remember when companies actually designed their devices in ways that made it possible to open them up and fix things? Yeah, me too. In any case, after removing one of the end caps of the chassis, we can see a little bit more of how this device is constructed, seemingly with all of the actual mixing circuitry and input jacks mounted to the front panel, with a power supply board on the bottom and the amplifier unit up top mounted to a giant heatsink. I was able to remove the whole front panel assembly relatively easily, though I did have to flex the chassis a bit to get it to let go of it. Then it was a simple cable to disconnect, and the whole mixer part of the mixer was out. I took a quick look at the PCB, and thankfully, it appears that at least the boards on this part of the mixer haven't suffered terribly from corrosion. Now that the front panel is removed, we can see the amplifier and the power supply boards in all of their glory. One of the things that immediately stuck out to me was the two massive banks of filter capacitors on the power supply board. This isn't too surprising, considering that there is a decently powerful audio amplifier in this, but I will need to be somewhat careful around this board as I'm not 100% sure that all of them are discharged. I was able to get the voltmeter on some of the capacitors though, and the ones that I could measure read 0 volts, which is a promising sign. I then disconnected the amplifier board's connections to the power supply board, while making sure to take photos of all of the connections of course, and removed the amplifier board by unscrewing the other end of the chassis. This amplifier board, like the mixer board, thankfully didn't seem to have much major corrosion on it, and therefore should be fine to return to service. Finally, it's time to remove the power supply board from this thing. Annoyingly, Soundcraft designed this part of the mixer pretty poorly because this metal part of the chassis is a single piece and you have to reach in to get the screws that hold in the PSU board. Thankfully, I was able to remove most of the screws without any trouble until I ran into this one at the end of the board. I don't know what it was with this screw, but I could not manage to get this thing out. Anytime I was able to get enough leverage on it to maybe turn it, it just stripped. Grabbing the screw with pliers and turning it like that was hopeless as well. And eventually, I got to the point of drilling the screw, which was awful because of the shape of the chassis, meaning that I couldn't get a good angle on the thing. The standoff wasn't able to be turned either, and overall, it was just a mess. After quite literally 45 minutes of work on this screw, running all over the place to grab and try different tools, drilling, failing, stripping the screw out, and all that good stuff, I desperately tried the pliers for what was probably the 10th time, and the screw turned. Needless to say, I was almost mad that it had just decided to work with the pliers only after 45 minutes of the other stuff, but at least I finally got it out. Though the board didn't technically make it out of this fiasco unscathed, as I did slip a few times and scratch it a bit, it's not all that big of a deal. There's no copper on this section of the board, and so these nicks and scratches are just on the solder mask that's not even covering traces or copper planes, and so it shouldn't affect the board in any way. One final thing that made this part of the job a bit sketchy too was the fact that the board used for this power supply circuit is a pretty cheap and flexible board. It would have been nice if a higher quality PCB had been used, as I was kind of scared at how much the board was flexing at times. While on the topic of high quality PCBs though, if you're interested in working on electronic devices like this, there's a chance that you might also take interest in the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. PCBWay is a company that provides several different high quality manufacturing services, such as CNC machining of many different kinds of metals, several 3D printing processes with, again, ample material options, and of course high quality PCB manufacturing that I personally use in all of my projects. When working with the insides of your devices, sometimes a custom manufactured part can be exactly what you need, and PCBWay is a great place to get one if you find yourself in need. Plus, you can use their services to create some really cool DIY tools that can also help in this kind of maintenance. Check out PCBWay's services at the link in the video description. Continuing past the screw incident of 2024, I was now finally able to double check that all 8 of the massive capacitors were fully discharged. I was relatively confident that they were discharged prior to this due to the few measurements that I was able to sneak in before removing the board, but it doesn't cost anything to double check. Everything should be removed from this mixer at this point, and now I can finally go through what I'll be doing here to give this mixer its facelift. Starting with the power supply board, I'll really only be giving this a quick and simple dusting, as there's thankfully not any serious corrosion on it, and so the only real issue is some of the dust and these 2 dead spiders. Onto the amplifier assembly, like the power supply board, I'll give this a bit of a dusting of course, and past that, I won't be doing too much to the PCB or the heatsink itself other than a bit of extra cleaning in a few spots. However, there is one part here that I will be completely replacing, and that is the old fan, as it's a bit noisy, and its bearing also sounds like it might be on its way out. So I quickly removed the 4 screws that hold the fan to the aluminum heatsink, and threw the old fan away, as I won't be needing it anymore. As for the mixer's chassis, the 2 end caps are actually in great condition, so I'm not going to do anything to them. However, the main chassis is in a rough shape, and I'll definitely see if I can't at least clean up the corrosion on it a tiny bit. Sadly, the corrosion is pretty deep, so I won't be able to get this in anywhere close to new condition, but I will try to wire brush off some of the worst of it. I'll also be replacing the fan mounted to this chassis, but I'll do that once I've got it in the garage, as Soundcraft, for whatever reason, chose to rivet this fan into place. Finally, the front panel of the mixer with the actual mixer circuitry, like the chassis end caps, will be pretty much left alone. At some point, I might give the front with all the knobs and jacks a wipe down, but thankfully, the PCBs themselves are still in great shape and really don't need any cleaning. In the garage, I gave the amplifier assembly as well as the power supply board their super quick cleanings, and then moved on to the more labor-intensive parts of this mixer. With the mixer's main chassis, the first thing I did was remove the fan by drilling out its rivets, and later I threw the fan and its disintegrating foam gasket away. Then it was on to about half an hour of wire brushing away the corrosion on this chassis. Yes, I could have maybe used a wire wheel on an angle grinder to speed up this process, but I've also heard horrifying stories about those wire wheels, and so chose a bit of a safer method. Also, if you're wondering, yes, I did wear a mask while doing this, and let's just say that based on its condition after the job was done, that was a good choice. One thing that I didn't show earlier when running through the parts of the mixer that I was going to clean was the outer plastic shell. Overall, this thing is in good condition, but some of the corrosion from the vents on the chassis got onto the plastic a bit, and so I just cleaned that up. Back at my desk, here you can see that I was able to improve the condition of the mixer's chassis at least a little bit. It's not perfect at all, but you can really see the extent of the corrosion with the metal being pitted and such. Anyway, it's still better than it was, and I feel good about putting the mixer back together in this condition. Starting with the power supply board, I was thankfully easily able to reinstall it and not have to drill out any more screws. I also found a suitable replacement for the screw that had to be drilled out so that I didn't leave one of the screw holes unoccupied. Before installing the amplifier, I made sure to install the replacement 80mm fan in the chassis' bottom vent. Originally, I installed these Be Quiet Pure Wings 2 80mm fans, but skipping ahead into the future a little bit, these fans turned out to not be powerful enough to keep the mixer cool when driving the amplifiers hard for long periods of time. So I actually ended up installing some different fans, but I'll get to that in just a few minutes. Anyway, I put the amplifier board into the chassis and anchored it in place with one of the end caps. I then reconnected all of the amplifier's connections to the power supply board, and I also just plugged the new fans into the old fan headers, because the power and ground pinouts lined up properly. The fan's tachometer and PWM wires just hung off the side of the plugs on the PCB unconnected. Now, since these connectors aren't technically meant to mesh, they didn't mesh quite as well as the original ones, and so I threw some electrical tape around the connections just to ensure that they wouldn't come loose if the mixer was bumped into something or set down really hard. Finally, I put the other end cap onto the chassis and installed the front mixing panel, which I mounted to the chassis with some shiny new screws that weren't all corroded like the old ones. And with that, this mixer's cleaning and fan replacement job was done. After giving the mixer a quick test, everything seems to be working exactly as it should be, and the new fans were much quieter. However, after running a more extensive test off camera, as I mentioned earlier, the Be Quiet fans didn't seem like they were capable of keeping up. The mixer ended up putting them at full speed, and even though it didn't turn off or enable any kind of temperature protection, which I'm not even sure if the mixer has, I didn't like the fact that it had to put them at 100% speed to keep itself cool after only about 20 minutes at 80% power. So I opened the mixer back up and changed the fans out for these Arctic P8 Maxes. And after running another near full power test of the mixer, everything stayed nicely cool and still decently quiet, meaning that I think I can call this job a success. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.